items that has preoccupied a lot of the coverage in lacartita.com is the internal faction war within the Sinaloa cartel. When I say internal factions, I really meant to say multiple factions within the Sinaloa cartel that are fighting one another for control of these highly lucrative drug routes that span this the coastal state of Sinaloa, which has no border with the United States, but does is close enough to Sonora, and that route that connects major ports in Mexico to um, major ports of entry, mostly legal in the United States, um, within all along the U.S.-Mexico border. That's what the conflict is about, and the descendants of El Mayo and El Chapo are basically engaged in a cartel spat, an internal cartel spat for control of those routes, control of those factions, and it's very difficult to make a sensible prediction of who's going to win, who's going to lose. Most of the time, it's a stalemate until one or a few routes becomes definitively belonging to one group member or faction, and the rest can be in constant dispute. And all the while, they're still finding ways to make money, transporting goods from one point, illicit goods from one point to another. Now, it is the case that there are many commentators who are not Mexican who have made very astute observations, particularly the Anglo-Americans who have worked in law enforcement. And those groups have something very valuable to contribute. They provide the perspective, a black and white perspective, about what the legalities around drug trafficking are, and also the negative consequences from the point of view of the U.S. judicial system. But the U.S. judicial system is difficult. It's antiquated. It enforces laws that at some level are no longer being respected. It took nearly 70 years for a war on drugs to be withdrawn with respect to marijuana, and we've seen the impacts that that has had, and mostly positive. And so, what this faction war shows us too is that when you take away the more rational elements of the leadership, um, like the elders, and you arrest those cartel leaders who are astute enough to manage the business end of it and keep it mostly transactional. When you affect that dynamic, you introduce the less rational elements, and you introduce those groups who are willing and able to jeopardize the lives of civilians. And so that's essentially what we're seeing with this faction war. We're seeing groups of people who um, would are in a developmental stage of leadership, right? They're not men in their 50s who have a global view of, at least from a regional perspective, they don't have necessarily a global view of how. Hello, thank you for joining. They don't have a global view of how their transactions and their business have externalities, how it's best to not have those externalities. Most of the time when you have the young guns leading this faction war, factionalizations of the Sinaloa cartel, when you have these younger guns leading that charge, you're going to see a lot more bloodshed. Like I mentioned, they're not in their mid 50s. They're not seasoned veterans who have gone through maybe even political crises. These are young people who are in the prime of their lives, and they're making decisions almost on impulse and instinct. And they are almost unconscious, or not conscious, sorry, of the collateral damage that they're imposing on the region. So unfortunately, that's what essentially is happening when it comes to U.S. extraditions and U.S. kingpin strategies being implemented. Um, what 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 I mentioned, or sorry, negative externalities. In any business, you have externalities that are cost to people external to that business and transaction. So in other words, let's say you have an oil tanker or oil driller, and that has a spill, which has happened in Santa Barbara, California. That's an externality from the business transaction between um, some oil contractor, the supply and the ship, and so on. and the externality is being eaten by the public at no real and there's no real compensation for it. So those are negative externalities and negative consequences of the business transaction. In the case of drug trafficking, well, it's very obvious what the exactly or pollution produced from a vehicle. Exactly. So in this case, drug trafficking and the control for routes, the externality is pretty clear, right? It's the spillover violence, and ultimately, when these people are arrested in Mexico, they're called civilians because that's what they are. They're literally civilians. They're criminals who are engaged in an illicit business, which occasionally spirals out of control because since everything is illegal, then that's the only means of recourse for any business transactions that they have within one another. And so, unfortunately, with this recent Sinaloa cartel faction war, what we're seeing is the spillover effect of one constantly pressuring the more rational leadership via the kingpin strategy, right? You take the heads because, hey, this kingpin controls XYZ group. And so we take the boss, everything's going to be better. Quite the contrary, you're taking out the elements that are more reasonable, seasoned, and quite willing to negotiate some type of Pax Narcotica, which is an old term from the 1990s in which the PRI essentially would, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to see it, um, provide some semblance of peace in exchange for kickbacks of whatever drug trafficking routes they were privy to, right? So the average governor would have a relationship with the local regional cartel, and there would be some kickback scheme in exchange for peaceful and tranquil transactions. No tourist hurts, no civilians, etc. On the US side, you have officials receiving bribes, which is well documented. The Border Patrol Agency has their elements who receive bribes. And when you have a year's worth of salary being given to you on any side of the border, any place, you can kind of understand the rationale behind an individual accepting that bribe. I'm not condoning it. What I'm saying is that it's fairly obvious that the economic incentive is there. And the faction war is not useful to anyone. What's useful is for precise, concerted efforts to interdict against the drugs that are most dangerous to public health and fixing the United States' public health crisis, which is these people can't get enough of fentanyl. I mean, the reality is that as long as there's a market, there will be somebody willing to cut each other's throat to access that market. Unfortunately, that's the case in this faction war. I mean, a briefcase of fentanyl represents millions of dollars. And the more illegal it becomes, the premium associated with transacting in that drug rises. So, in other words, let's say I send US Special Forces to decommission a laboratory. Well, that's just inflated the price and created an even bigger incentive to transact in it. So if you don't deal with the actual public health addictions of the United States, which has a population that is just consumed and addicted with the substance, you'll never get anywhere. You'll just raise the price of the goods up, and it's probably a signal to drug traffickers that they should switch to a drug that is less addictive. That is clear enough to anyone, even to the most casual observer, that um, this incoming administration is probably because it's so ethnocentric, it's so fixated on the white man's plight, they're probably embarrassed that they can't seem to control their male population and get them to stop consuming fentanyl or stop consuming any of these illicit services that they so often go to countries in Latin America to receive. And so these predictable failings on the public's part, the American public's part, are what feeds the constant demand for supply, right? It's what feeds that natural market element to transact in fentanyl. And the faction war in Sinaloa is just that. It's a faction war. It has nothing to do with the extradition of Omayo, although there are a lot of questions as to why he was allowed to operate in both countries for so long, right? There's rumors and reasonable ones at that about some type of allegiance or a connection with one of those three-letter agencies that operates abroad. No need in naming them. It'll get the video flag. Um, and that seems reasonable because someone at his level with his profile must have gotten a lot of decent intelligence telling him that he should remain in the more rural parts of Mexico to avoid any type of extradition or arrest, right? And the Mexican army is a complex army, right? It has way too many generals. It has so many generals that any one of them can be in the take while another one is completely legitimate, or simply in the take of a rival cartel. So the amount of money and volume of transactions that is around illicit substances is just too damn high. It has to be the case that the public health aspect in the United States is dealt with in parallel with some type of anti-corruption scheme in Mexico, and also just some type of streamlining of who's in charge of what region, because it's a lot easier to predict law enforcement if there are checks and balances and some type of cohesion on both sides. And right now, the approach that the Trump administration is planning to take isn't particularly reasonable. Uh, it's too it's too jingoistic, it's too aggressive, and people don't respond well to that, especially people that have the second best army in Latin America. They have enough guns to protect themselves, maybe not the civilian population, but certainly they'll be able to weather any storm that is launched from the U.S., despite the fact that they're sending all types of special armed forces over to Mexico. There's plenty of guns there. There's no telling how they will react to something that is too aggressive, and that could be a huge embarrassment. Now, one thing that people haven't considered in the deployment of special forces to Mexico is the simple fact that they could get bribed too. Basically, you're creating a situation where, okay, you've had people in the DEA and arrived, you've had people in Border Patrol bribed, you've had people in every single agency that has come into contact with this business. It's just not a country thing, with this business, bribed and subject to that privilege. And now what you have is the possibility that you have directly U.S. special operators getting a briefcase of $1 million to look the other way, and that could be a very complicated scenario for everyone. And I think that's what we should be cautioning against as we start getting stupidly aggressive on what is essentially a public health issue on the United States side, right? You can't control your male youth. You can't seem to get them to stop consuming um, opioids and painkillers and meth. So you are going to bomb or launch precision strikes against the labs that make the meth. No, you need to look at your addiction and water it down somehow. So that's our closing remarks on this Sinaloa factions and some context about how this is really just a internal factional war. There are some details about El Mayo simply turning himself in. There's no um, novella style extradition or betrayal. He just turned himself in, and the kids are fighting over the spoils. That's what it is.